We're used to hobbits being pretty peaceful. After all, they do live in a hole and spend their days smoking pipes and eating second breakfast. But what would happen if a band of goblins attacked and destroyed the Shires? This is something that has been explored a few times in the books, and it's one of the rare occasions where hobbits are actually allowed to fight back. But could Eden, Frodo, and Bilbo defeat a horde of these nasty creatures? Well, we can at least look at how other hobbits have fared against orcs in the past. Of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the Battle of the Fords of Izon from The Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers. Here, Merry and Pippin are captured by Saruman's army, but not before helping the men of Rohan to defend the bridge over the Izon River. And while Merry and Pippin are able to escape, there are still many orcs and Uruk high slain by the Rohirrim. In fact, it's a decisive victory for the men of Rohan, with over 200 enemy soldiers killed. But the same cannot be said about the battle that took place much earlier during the events of The Hobbit. Here, Bilbo Baggins was forced to flee from a company of goblins after he had stolen their treasure. And while he eventually found refuge in Rivendell, this wasn't before he was almost caught several times. Goblins were also the main enemies of the three hunters, including the father of Bilbo and Frodo, during their trip to the Lone Lands. Though the hunters never really engaged the goblins in battle, they did manage to avoid them until they came across the Misty Mountains. Once inside the mountains, the company became separated, and it seemed likely that the goblins would catch up with Thorin and his companions. However, the hunters weren't fully helpless, and Thorin was able to kill an entire company of goblins using his axe. So it seems like a small band of tough dwarves can hold off a goblin horde, at least for a while. The best example of a hobbit standing up to goblins, however, comes from an early story in Unfinished Tales. It tells of an ancestor of Bilbo and Frodo named Bulldog Took, who was known for his bravery and skill in hunting. One day, Bulldog set out into the wild and dangerous old forest and never returned home. Everyone assumed he had been lost forever until a group of Tookish hobbits tracked him down. They found him deep within the old forest and surrounded by goblins. The hobbits called for Bulldog to run away, but he refused. Instead, he told them to get out of there, that he could handle this situation himself. So the Tookish hobbits left and watched from afar as Bulldog fought the goblins. He managed to kill several of them, but was ultimately overwhelmed and captured. But after the battle, the Tookish hobbits returned and were surprised to find that Bulldog wasn't hurt at all. It turned out the goblins had only knocked him unconscious and left him there. Intrigued, Bulldog decided to go along with his captors and see where they were going. This ended up being a huge mistake, because not only did the goblins bring him to their lair, but they also intended to sacrifice him to their master, Gollum. Luckily, Bulldog was able to free Gollum from the chains that bound him, which made the creature very grateful. As a reward, Gollum gave Bulldog the magic sword, Sting, which would later pass down to Bilbo and then Frodo. We don't know how many goblins were killed by Bulldog, but it's clear that he more than held his own in combat. In fact, given his skill in hunting and experience in the wild, it's entirely possible that he could have defeated an entire goblin horde. If anyone could take on a whole army of goblins, it would surely be Frodo, but after all, he did destroy the One Ring, which contained all the power of Mordor behind it. But how would Frodo fare in such a situation? Well, let us imagine that as closer to the age that he was when he left the Shire at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, he might be able to take on a few goblins, thanks to his newfound skills as a ring. But unfortunately, he probably wouldn't last long. The goblins would eventually catch on to his weakness and gang up on him, overwhelming him with their numbers. Even worse, Frodo would be fighting without any allies. All of the other hobbits would have been captured and taken to the goblin lair. So there's no hope of backup arriving in time. But what about Bilbo Baggins? Considering that he was once a reluctant burglar, it's not inconceivable that he could defeat a few goblins in one-on-one combat. But in a group setting, things become much more difficult. Bilbo might be able to hold his own for a little while, but eventually the goblins would surround him and drag him down. Of course, Bilbo is quite clever, so he might be able to trick some of his attackers, but this wouldn't be enough to save him. Ultimately, he would be captured along with the other hobbits. But when they arrived at the goblin lair, Bilbo would use his skills as a burglar to break them free. What about Samwise Gamgee? Unlike Bilbo and Frodo, Sam is strong and courageous, but he's not exactly a fighter. Sure, he could probably throw a punch or two, but he wouldn't last long against a horde of goblins. Not only would they be too strong for him, but he also wouldn't want to harm them. Sam is a pacifist at heart and would never intentionally kill another living being. So if Sam ever found himself in a situation where he was surrounded by goblins, he would simply submit and become their prisoner. Merry Brandybuck and Pippin Took, on the other hand, would put up a fight, but they would also eventually be defeated. These two hobbits proved themselves to be brave warriors in The Lord of the Rings, but they only really shined when fighting alongside the men of Rohan. Against a horde of goblins, Merry and Pippin would simply be over. They aren't as skilled as Frodo and Bilbo, nor are they as strong as Sam. In fact, the only reason Merry and Pippin survived the Battle of the Fords of Izon was because they were able to sneak away and hide. When fighting the forces of Sauron, they were able to succeed because they had allies and a clear goal in mind. But on their own, they'd be no match for a horde of goblins. But what about all of the hobbits of the Shire all at once? Could they stand up to an invading force of goblins? The answer is probably not. Hobbits are generally peaceful creatures and would never dream of attacking someone, unless they had to defend themselves. It's this attitude that made them so easy prey for Sauron's forces. Even though the Shire was located in the heart of the Brandywine Valley and protected by the Weather Hills, it still fell to the forces of Mordor during the events of The Lord of the Rings. The Shire was eventually liberated, but this was mostly due to the efforts of Bilbo, Frodo, and the other ring. If it wasn't for the destruction of the One Ring, the Shire would have remained under the control of Saruman and the Ring. So the answer to the question posed in the title is yes. Goblins could easily destroy the Shire! And while hobbits are capable of defending themselves, they aren't real fighters. They just don't have the stomach for violence. The Hobbit shows us that goblins are easily frightened by anything different, strange, or new. This means that if someone or something unexpected appeared in the middle of the Shire, it would be enough to send the goblins running. Gandalf, for example, was able to scare off the goblins that had been following Bilbo simply by showing himself to them. Similarly, the Balrog in the Balrog Mines was able to drive back the orcs guarding the bridge simply by roaring. So, if a powerful wizard, or even just a large animal, showed up in the Shire, the goblins would most likely run away. But that's all we can say, for sure. The rest, no telling what a determined band of goblins would do if they decided to lay siege to the Shire. While the hobbits would undoubtedly put up a valiant defense, they would eventually run out of supplies and be forced to surrender. At that point, the goblins could do whatever they wanted with the hobbits, but it's unlikely that they would be killed. After all, goblins aren't known for their intelligence, and they would probably just torture the hobbits for fun. But that's a topic we don't want to explore further. Let's just say that it would be unpleasant for everyone involved. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and watch our other videos about Middle-earth.